All right, today, APUSH people, we're going to take a look at the period 1824 to 1840. We're going to review it really quickly, so let's get started. These are the chapters in the APUSH books that we're going to be reviewing, but pretty much if you're studying that time period, this is going to help you out. Big idea here, 1824, the election will formally put an end to the era of good feelings. Here's what happens. There's a whole bunch of Republicans that want to be president. You got John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay. They all want to be president, and the results of the election reveal a problem. Jackson wins the popular vote. He gets the most electoral votes, but he does not get a majority of the electoral votes. And under the Constitution and the 12th Amendment, that means the election must go to the House of Representatives. Now, Jackson's feeling pretty good about this election because he's the only candidate that has support in all the different sections of the country. He's got northern voters, southern voters, and western voters. So the election goes to the House, and this is the background to the corrupt bargain. Here's what goes down. As I said, under the 12th Amendment, they must choose, the House of Reps must choose between the top three candidates. William Crawford is out because he suffers a stroke during the campaign, and the Speaker of the House is Henry Clay. He has something in common with John Quincy Adams. They're both supporters of the American system. They're down with the tariff, the bank, and the internal improvements. They have a very similar political philosophy. The Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, throws his support behind John Quincy Adams. And next thing you know, John Quincy Adams is named President of the United States by the House of Reps, and a couple weeks later, Henry Clay is picked to be the Secretary of State. And this is a really awesome position because 3 of the former presidents were Secretary of State prior to becoming president. It's kind of seen as a stepping stone. Jackson and his supporters see this as corruption. This is a bribe. It looks like Henry Clay got to become Secretary of State in exchange for supporting John Quincy Adams for president. And Jackson's peeps denounce this as the corrupt bargain, and Jackson is pissed. In fact, once John Quincy Adams becomes president, it's not exactly a fairy tale ending. Remember, as Foreign Secretary of State, he had achieved a huge amount, some of those treaties you see right there. But as president, he had tremendous difficulties. When he takes office in 1825, he never really had the majority of support. There's charges of corruption kind of hanging over his administration. He doesn't use the spoil system to reward those who are loyal to him, and as a result, his presidency is going to be basically uneventful. And what happens after 1824 is you get this final split amongst united Republicans. You know, that era of good feelings is all over. And what you see is the people who support John Quincy Adams become known as the National Republicans. And the people who are supporting Jackson are more of the old school Democratic Republicans, eventually going to be known as the Democrats. So there's a whole bunch of stuff happening, but in 1828, the next election takes place. There's a lot of dirty campaigning, and the results, once again, are voted on by sectional lines. John Quincy Adams is running for re-election. He does get the Northeast because of his support for manufacturing, but ultimately he loses, and Andrew Jackson crushes John Quincy Adams in the rematch. Not only that, but when Jackson becomes president with the election of 1828, he will be the first president from the West, from the state of Tennessee, and he is really symbolic of this idea of the common man, a man without formal schooling. In fact, one of the big reasons why Jackson wins is because of something that was going on in American society all the way back in 1800 and beyond. And that is the democratization of American society. Most states, if you look at these two maps, were eliminating property requirements for voting. And so it was becoming more and more open, the political system, because you were moving towards universal white male suffrage, the right to vote. Now, left out of this democratization were, of course, women, African Americans, Native Americans, and any group not being into the white male category. But this was an enormous trend in American politics and was an important one that Jackson benefits from. Jackson's inauguration is very symbolic as this victory for the common men. Thousands and thousands of people come to Washington, D.C. to celebrate Jackson's presidency. And Jackson as president is going to be symbolic of the political changes of the time. Back in the day, from 1790 to 1828, the way candidates were picked was something called the caucus system. And what that was a small group of individuals within the party would choose the candidate. Following 1828, you have this move to the party convention, where all the members from the political party would nominate the candidate. And this was seen as more democratic and more open and more kind of in line with the times. Another important thing about Jackson that you should be aware of is the spoil system. Jackson's not the only one to do it, but he does it more than any other president up until that point, and that is rewarding political supporters with public office. If you support me, I'm going to appoint you to a position within the government. And for Jackson, he defended this on democratic grounds. You're opening up politics to new and more people. But there was a downside, and that is corruption and ineffectiveness. Because if you're being appointed because of your loyalty rather than your merit, you're going to get people that are not very good in those positions. But the spoil system was used by Jacksonians as a way to bring in new people into politics. Now, a big crisis that's going to occur under Andrew Jackson is going to be the nullification crisis. And here's what happens. 1828, Congress passes a tariff. Northerners love it, Southerners hate it. Sectionalism is on the rise again because you have this dispute over whether or not a tariff is good or bad. What happens is Southerners refer to the tariff as the tariff of abominations. We have a video on that. Check it out in more detail. A pamphlet was written anonymously by the Vice President John C. Calhoun, called the South Carolina Exposition. And in this pamphlet, they basically outlined the theory of nullification. And that theory basically said a state had the right to decide whether to obey a federal law or to nullify it or to ignore it within that state. And remember, this was done during the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions by Jefferson and Madison as a result of the Sedition Act passed by the Federalist Congress and John Adams. And so South Carolina says we have the right to nullify this, but they don't have the 2/3 votes necessary to do so, but Congress passes another tariff in 1832. And this tariff, even though it lowers the rates, angers Southerners, and South Carolina is pissed, and they approve nullification. And basically say that the tariff would not be collected in the state of South Carolina. And they threatened secession. If you try to collect this tax, we're going to leave the Union. And this is a crisis known as the nullification crisis. Now, Jackson is not a fan of the tariff, but he is the president and he wants to defend the Union. And this crisis, which really had the nation on the brink of a mini civil war, is solved by something called the olive branch and the sword. One, the sword. The Force Bill of 1833, the federal army was told that we could collect the tariff. Nullification would not be tolerated, so South Carolina, you better pay up. The second part of that, or the olive branch piece, is the compromise tariff negotiated by Henry Clay, known as the Tariff of 1833, which will gradually lower the tariff rates. The crisis ends, and nullification was rescinded. South Carolina backs down, the Union is preserved, but what's important about this is really a sign of things to come, because compromise won't work once we get to 1860 and we have South Carolina actually being the first state to leave the Union upon the election of Lincoln. Other things about Jackson you should be aware of is the pattern that was happening way before Jackson was population was moving west. And a big part of Jackson's presidency is going to be his native policy. His goal was he wanted to open up land in the Southwest for Southern planters. Jackson already had a reputation. He had fought native people in Florida with that unauthorized military expedition just before the Adams-Onis Treaty. And now he, along with Congress, support the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And this basically says, and the 5 civilized tribes were supposed to be removed from this area in the Southwest, or Southeast, depending upon where you're looking at it from. The Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Cherokee, and the Seminole were supposed to be removed as a result west of the Mississippi River. And this was going to be a forced removal. Some of the tribes decided to leave, like the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, without much resistance. And these 5 civilized tribes, many of them, including the Cherokee, had adopted numerous things that were quote-unquote civilized, like they owned private property. Many of them were Christian. In fact, they were so civilized, some even owned slaves. Sarcasm intended. Here's what happens as a result of the Indian Removal Act. Jackson's policy is going to lead to the uprooting of thousands of native people. In fact, some are going to resist. The Seminole Indians in Florida are going to refuse to leave, and you're going to have something called the Second Seminole War happening in 1835, and a brutal war between the U.S. Army and the Seminole native people. And eventually the Seminoles will be defeated. Another important thing you should keep in mind is the Supreme Court actually protects the rights of one of the groups, the Cherokee Indian. In the case of Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the court rules that Georgia law does not apply to the Cherokee Nation, and the Cherokee Nation cannot be forced to move by the U.S. government because Georgia law doesn't apply to them. However, famously, Jackson chooses to ignore the federal court's decision. He famously says, "John Marshall has made his decision. Let him enforce it if he can." And as a result is in 1838, after Jackson had already left office, the Trail of Tears takes place, the forced removal of over 15,000 Cherokee native people west of the Mississippi to Oklahoma Territory. Thousands of Cherokee will die during this horrific event in our American past. Another thing to keep in mind is what happens with the bank in Andrew Jackson. In 1816, remember, the U.S. Congress, under the American system, gave the Bank of the United States another 20-year charter. And it wasn't due to expire until 1836, but Henry Clay decides that he's going to bring this issue up in the election of 1832 by approving it a little early. He wants to make this bank issue an issue that Andrew Jackson has to deal with. Now, Jackson in 1832 decides to veto the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, and some in Congress accuse him of exercising too much power. Now, what ends up happening is, recall, in 1819, the Supreme Court had ruled that the national bank was constitutional in the famous Supreme Court case McCulloch versus Maryland. Not only that, but Jackson's veto of the bank was seen by many of his opponents as another veto. And he was seen by some, his critics, as vetoing excessively and abusing executive power. And a little fun fact is, Andrew Jackson had vetoed more times than all the other previous presidents combined. So he vetoes the bank, and in 1832, Henry Clay goes down in defeat in the presidential election. Andrew Jackson wins, and Jackson, not content with letting the bank just exist as is, he decides he's going to destroy the bank prior to 1836. And he does so by ordering with the withdrawal of federal funds from the bank in 1833. And he actually puts these federal funds into what are called pet banks, or state banks that were loyal to the Democratic Party, hence the name pet banks. The head of the bank, a guy by the name of Nicholas Biddle, calls in the loans that were due to the Federal National Bank, and this causes all sorts of widespread economic uncertainty, panic, and the economy basically collapses. In fact, they try to kind of calm the situation down because in 1836 the Specie Circular is issued, which requires that public land be purchased with gold or silver, so-called hard currency. However, it's too little too late, because in 1837, after Jackson's out of office, you have the Panic of 1837, and it's caused by a whole bunch of factors: over-speculation in Western lands, a bank battle, the Specie Circular, and the economy just goes into the toilet. And Jackson's treatment and his bank policies are oftentimes seen as a contributing factor to this panic. Unfortunately for Martin Van Buren, he gets elected in 1836. He's running against the Whig Party, the opposition party to Andrew Jackson. You'll see the Whigs, they run way too many people in 1836. Martin Van Buren becomes the president, and unfortunately he'll get the really bad nickname. Not only is he Wolverine's dad, but he is called Martin Van Ruin, because as soon as he takes office, the whole panic in the economy goes into a tailspin. There are new political parties that are forming. Recall, the Democrats, they believe in a small national government. They're more in line with the old school Democratic Republicans. They basically believe the federal government should stay out of economic affairs, no tariffs, no banks, things of that nature. They also believe the federal government should stay out of social issues. And of course, their strength is mainly going to be in the South, the West, and amongst workers in urban areas. The new party that forms are the Whigs, and they're kind of similar to the Federalist or the National Republicans. They favor a strong central government, so people like Henry Clay, they believe in the American system, internal improvements, the bank, and tariffs, and they tended to support some of the moral reform movements, the prohibition of liquor, the support for public schooling, and things like this. Their support tended to be in areas in New England, amongst Protestants and religious people, and so on. So you have this second party system, and you could see that being developed on this chart right here. Some major events, and the Democrats and the Whigs are going to be the two top dogs in the 1830s. And the Whigs really are the opposition party to Andrew Jackson's policies. One last thing before we head out. Mexico wins its independence from Spain in 1821-1823, and basically Mexico, the Mexican government, gives a bunch of land to a lot of Americans who start coming into Texas. One of the famous one was a guy by the name of Stephen Austin. He's given huge amounts of land in what is today modern-day Texas. There were a couple of rules. One, you had to become Catholic, and you had to follow Mexican law. The problem is so many Americans are coming in with their slaves, and Mexico decides in 1830 to put restrictions on further immigration. They also decide to outlaw slavery, and this angers those white people, those Americans that are now in Texas. As a result, in 1836, as a result of this, Mexico trying to control Texas and the Texans not wanting to be controlled, in 1836, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. Not wanting to allow them to leave, Santa Anna sends 6,000 troops into Texas to basically regulate and stop this independence movement from being successful. Of course, you have very famous moments like the 13-day siege at the Alamo, where 200 Texans are eventually killed after fighting bravely by the Mexican army. And while that is taking place, Sam Houston, the hero of the Texas movement for independence, wins a decisive battle at the Battle of San Jacinto. Now, what ends up happening is this causes a major issue, because Texas decides, when it's the Lone Star Republic, it's its own nation in 1836, Santa Anna, rejects the treaty that he was forced to sign. He says, no, I don't agree that Texas is independent. In fact, Texas in 1837 is recognized by Andrew Jackson just as he's about to leave office. He says, yes, we recognize the Republic of Texas. The problem that arises, though, is that Texas wants admission into the Union, and nobody wants to be the one to take this issue on, because this is a contentious issue. Because if Texas gets added to the Union, would this be another slave state? And the answer is it would, and Northerners were not going to have this. So the issue of Texas is going to be sidestepped by many presidents because of the issue of slavery. To be continued. One last thing before we close out. In 1840, you do get the first Whig president elected. The war hero, the Battle of Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison, runs for the presidency. He's battling Martin Van Buren, Wolverine's dad. And what ends up happening is you have the very famous log cabin campaign, where William Henry Harrison adopts this kind of symbolism of the log cabin and hard cider. These are the symbols of his campaign, because he wants to appeal to the masses. And this was not really based upon any reality, but it works. And in 1840, William Henry Harrison is elected as the oldest man up until that point to take the presidency, 68 years old back then. And he dies 32 days after taking office, being our shortest termed president ever. That's going to close us out. Make sure you subscribe to Joe's Productions for more quick APUSH review videos. Thanks for watching. Click like and have a good day. Peace.